From the moment Mrs. Pengilly steps into Poirot's study, her story feels both ordinary and hauntingly peculiar. A seemingly inconspicuous woman, with her faded appearance and ordinary attire, Mrs. Pengilly could easily be dismissed as just another quiet resident of a rural town. But beneath her modest exterior lies a tale of fear, doubt, and mounting suspicion. A narrative that resonates with the themes of secrecy and betrayal, central to Christie's writing. Mrs. Pengilly's distress runs deeper than mere physical discomfort. It's the kind of unease that seeps into her every thought, keeping her awake at night, and filling her mind with doubts about her husband's actions. The persistent worry that she might be poisoned has consumed her, rooted not just in physical discomfort but also in the psychological torment of uncertainty. The idea of being poisoned, though seemingly irrational, has become an all-consuming fear that haunts her waking hours and casts a long shadow over her daily life. Poirot, ever meticulous and patient, possesses the rare ability to see through these fears and understand their deeper significance, even when they appear far-fetched or illogical. His reputation for solving mysteries with precision and insight is precisely what Mrs. Pengilly needs, as her doubts about her husband are more than mere suspicions. They're a source of constant anxiety. From the moment Mrs. Pengilly steps into Poirot's study, her story feels both ordinary and hauntingly peculiar. A seemingly inconspicuous woman, with her faded appearance and ordinary attire, Mrs. Pengilly could easily be dismissed as just another quiet resident of a rural town. But beneath her modest exterior lies a tale of fear, doubt, and mounting suspicion. A narrative that resonates with the themes of secrecy and betrayal, central to Christie's writing. Mrs. Pengilly's distress is not just about physical illness. It's the kind of unease that keeps her awake at night, tormenting her with doubts about her husband's actions. The idea of being poisoned, a fear rooted in both physical and psychological discomfort, has taken root in her mind. Poirot, ever meticulous and patient, understands the significance of her fears, even when they seem far-fetched. As their conversation unfolds, Poirot's probing reveals deeper complexities. The tension between loyalty and doubt becomes more evident when Mrs. Pengilly mentions Frida Stanton, her niece who had been living with them for 8 years, but abruptly left a week ago due to escalating tensions. Poirot's keen observation of Mrs. Pengilly's discomfort and subtle hints about Frida's absence indicate there is more to the story. Mrs. Pengilly's mention of a yellow-haired hussy adds another layer of suspicion, suggesting an affair or inappropriate behavior between her husband and a woman who works for him. Poirot's probing further highlights the conflicts and hidden motives that could be fueling Mrs. Pengilly's fear. Her hesitation to speak openly about her husband and her reliance on Poirot's discretion illustrate the fragile balance between trust and suspicion. Poirot, ever analytical, remains attentive to every detail, especially when he notices the strands of feather scarf Mrs. Pengilly nervously rips from her attire, details that suggest a deeper anxiety. The dialogue reveals that Mrs. Pengilly's concerns are not just limited to the idea of poisoning, but are intertwined with larger doubts about her husband's loyalty. Poirot's conclusion that Mrs. Pengilly is neither hysterical nor a superb actress leaves him intrigued, sensing there might be a genuine, unresolved mystery here. This complexity, where suspicion clashes with loyalty, captures the very essence of Christie's storytelling, where human emotions and hidden truths collide, leaving Poirot to piece together the puzzle with his trademark methodical precision. The best train of the day was the 1:50 from Paddington, which reached Polgarwith just after 7 o'clock. The journey had been uneventful, and I had to rouse myself from a pleasant nap to alight upon the platform of the bleak little station. We took our bags to the Duchy Hotel, and after a light meal, Poirot suggested that we pay an after-dinner call on my so-called cousin, Mrs. Pengilly. The Pengillys' house stood a little way back from the road, nestled amidst an old-fashioned cottage garden filled with the sweet fragrance of stocks and mignonette carried on the evening breeze. It was impossible to reconcile such old-world charm with thoughts of violence or murder. Poirot rang the bell and knocked, but when there was no answer he rang again. This time, after a pause, the door was opened by a disheveled-looking servant whose red-rimmed eyes were tear-streaked and whose nose sniffed violently. "We wish to see Mrs. Pengilly," Poirot explained calmly. "May we enter?" The maid stared at us for a moment before answering in a voice filled with both weariness and resignation. "Haven't you heard, then? She's dead. Died this evening, about half an hour ago." We stood there, stunned into silence, the weight of her words settling heavily over us. Finally, I managed to ask, "What did she die of?" The maid gave a quick glance over her shoulder, as though making sure no one could hear her before speaking. "There's some as could tell." Her tone was firm, though filled with unease. "If it wasn't that somebody ought to be in the house with the missus, I'd pack my box and go tonight. But I'll not leave her dead with no one to watch by her. It's not my place to say anything, and I'm not going to say anything, but everybody knows. It's all over the town, and if Mr. Radnor don't write to the Home Secretary, someone else will. The doctor may say what he likes. Didn't I see the master with my own eyes a lifting down of the weed killer from the shelf this very evening? And didn't he jump when he turned round and saw me watching him? And the missus's gruel there on the table, all ready to take to her? Not another bit of food passes my lips while I am in this house. Not if I die for it." Her words hung in the air, laden with suspicion and fear. Poirot, who had been standing quietly, struck his clenched hand into his palm, his expression pale with frustration. "An imbecile, a criminal imbecile," he muttered, his voice taut with regret. "That is what I have been, Hastings. I have boasted of my little gray cells, and now I have lost a human life, a life that came to me to be saved. Never did I dream that anything would happen so soon. May the good God forgive me, but I never believed anything would happen at all." Her story seemed to me artificial. Poirot's voice trailed off, his face etched with disappointment. The maid's accusations had driven home the severity of the situation. We made our way to Dr. Adams, the town's red-faced, genial country doctor, who was typical of those characters found in countless fiction tales. Dr. Adams received us politely enough, but the moment Poirot hinted at the nature of our visit, his jovial demeanor evaporated, replaced by a deep frown. His face flushed, turning a purplish hue. Damned nonsense, every word of it," he snapped, his tone sharp with irritation. Poirot, however, remained unyielding. "Perhaps you would care to explain, Dr. Adams," Poirot replied coolly, "why Mrs. Pengilly, a woman who sought help, is now dead under such mysterious circumstances." Dr. Adams's frown deepened, his confidence shaken. "I've told you, there's nothing to this. I've treated her. There was nothing that could not be explained medically. Her death was purely natural." But Poirot wasn't convinced. His keen eyes studied the doctor's flushed face, and I could see the cogs turning in his mind. There was more here than mere coincidence or medical negligence. Poirot was already forming new hypotheses, unwilling to accept the doctor's convenient dismissal. "The case," he muttered to himself, "interests me enormously, though the red-faced doctor was of no further help. Gastritis, pure and simple, that's what the doctor insists on. This town's a hotbed of gossip, Hastings. Old women sitting in their parlors, stirring up scandal like they've got nothing better to do. They read those trashy newspapers, the ones filled with nonsense about poisoned townsfolk, and before you know it, someone's imagination is off like a galloping horse. They see a bottle of weed killer on a shelf, and boom! It's all poison and intrigue in their minds. I know Edward Pengelly. Trust me, he wouldn't poison his own grandmother's dog, let alone his wife. So, why on earth would he want to poison her? Poirot cleared his throat, his tone shifting as he leaned in. There is one thing, Monsieur le Docteur, that perhaps you do not know. The doctor's brow furrowed, confusion flashing in his eyes as Poirot began outlining the details of Mrs. Pengelly's visit, the fears she had shared, her search for answers. No one could have been more astonished than Dr. Adams. His eyes nearly popped out of his head as he stammered, "God bless my soul. The poor woman must have been mad. Why didn't she speak to me? That was the proper thing to do." Poirot raised an eyebrow, his calm expression unflinching. "And have her fears ridiculed?" Dr. Adams faltered, clearly unsure of how to respond. "Not at all, not at all," he mumbled, his mind visibly spinning. Poirot's smile deepened as we left the doctor's house. He is as obstinate as a pig, that one. He has said it is gastritis, therefore it is gastritis. All the same, he has the mind uneasy. I sighed, my disappointment evident. What's our next step? Poirot glanced at me, a twinkle of amusement in his eyes. A return to the inn, and a night of horror upon one of your cheap English provincial beds, mon ami. It is a thing to make pity, the cheap English bed. I couldn't help but chuckle at his sarcasm. And tomorrow? I asked, already weary of the slow pace. Rien à faire. We must return to town and await developments. Poirot's words were far from comforting. That's very tame, I said, my disappointment growing. Suppose there are none. Poirot's lips curved into a knowing smile. There will be, I promise you that. Our old doctor may give as many certificates as he pleases. He cannot stop several hundred tongues from wagging, Hastings, and they will wag to some purpose, I can tell you that. The following morning, our train to town didn't leave until 11, giving Poirot a curious itch. Before we start for the station, he said with a thoughtful frown, I'd like to see Miss Frida Stanton, the niece mentioned to us by the late Mrs. Pengelly. I glanced at him, my curiosity piqued. Where will we find her? Poirot pulled a map from his pocket. We'll find her lodging easily enough. We tracked down her address without much trouble. When we arrived, she welcomed us with a mix of confusion and apprehension. A tall, dark young man stood beside her, his gaze steady and sure. Mr. Jacob Radnor, she introduced him, her tone flustered. Miss Frida Stanton was an extremely pretty girl, her dark hair and eyes striking against her fair complexion. The flash in her dark eyes told of a temper that, from experience, would be unwise to provoke. She was the picture of the old Cornish type, strong, fiery, and unyielding. Poor auntie, Frida said quietly, her voice soft with regret, as Poirot introduced himself and explained his reason for visiting. It's terribly sad. I've been wishing all morning that I'd been kinder, more patient. She glanced at Radnor, who gently interrupted. You stood a great deal, Frida. His voice was gentle but firm, acknowledging the burden she had carried. Yes, Jacob, she admitted, but I've got a sharp temper, I know. After all, it was only silliness on Auntie's part. I ought to have just laughed and not minded. Of course, it's all nonsense her thinking she was poisoned, but still. Her voice trailed off, the doubt still lingering in her tone. Poirot studied her closely, his keen eyes reading between the lines. It seems, mademoiselle, that while you believe her suspicions were exaggerated, they still touched a nerve. Tell me, did your aunt show any signs of distress beyond her fears of poison? Frida hesitated, then shook her head. "No, nothing else," she replied. She seemed worried, but not more than usual. Poirot pressed on, his interest piqued. "And this Mr. Jacob Radnor, what is his connection to all this? Could he perhaps have been a confidant, someone your aunt might have spoken to?" Radnor stiffened at the question, his dark eyes narrowing. "I'm just a friend," he said quickly, though there was something defensive in his tone. Poirot's smile widened slightly. "A friend," he repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "Very well. Thank you for your time, Miss Stanton. If we require anything further, we shall be in touch." As we left the house, Poirot remained silent, his thoughts clearly far ahead of mine. The case was far from resolved, and I could sense that Poirot was far from finished unraveling the truth. Thinking back on it now, I wasn't entirely sure why Frida was so convinced her uncle was poisoning her. She seemed worse after every meal he gave her, Frida explained, her brow furrowing. But I'm sure it was just in her head. She got it into her mind that she'd be ill, and then she was. It was all in her imagination. Poirot leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "What was the actual cause of your disagreement, mademoiselle?" he asked gently. Miss Stanton hesitated, glancing at Radnor. He must have sensed the hesitation, for he quickly took the hint. "I must be going now, Frida," he said, his tone casual but firm. "See you this evening. Goodbye, gentlemen. You're off to the station, I assume?" Poirot nodded, not missing a beat. Radnor tipped his hat and left without another word. "You're engaged, aren't you?" Poirot asked with a sly smile, turning back to Frida. She blushed and nodded. "Yes, that's right." "And that was the real trouble with your aunt, wasn't it?" Poirot pressed, his tone calm but probing. Miss Stanton bit her lip. "It wasn't so much that she didn't approve of the match," she confessed, "but, well, you'll have to understand." "Auntie." She stopped, her expression troubled. "Yes?" Poirot encouraged gently. "It seems rather harsh to speak ill of her now that she's gone. But unless I tell you, you won't really understand. Auntie was infatuated with Jacob, completely infatuated." Poirot's eyebrows rose. Infatuated. Yes, absurd, isn't it? She was over 50 and he's not quite 30, but there it was. She was silly about him. I had to tell her at last that it was me he was after, and that's when things really turned sour. She didn't believe a word of it and was rude and insulting. No wonder I lost my temper. Jacob and I agreed it was best for me to leave until she came to her senses. Poor Auntie, I suppose she was in a bit of a state altogether. "Indeed," Poirot said thoughtfully. "Thank you, mademoiselle, for clarifying things." To my surprise, Radnor was waiting for us when we exited the house. "I imagine Frida's told you everything," he said, his tone calm but guarded. "Most of it," Poirot replied. "It was a terribly unfortunate situation," Radnor continued, glancing around as though worried someone might overhear. "Very awkward for me, as you can imagine. I needn't tell you it wasn't my doing. At first, I thought it was all leading somewhere with Frida and her aunt, but it was absurd, completely absurd, and extremely unpleasant." Poirot watched him silently. "When are you and Miss Stanton planning to marry?" he asked. "Soon, I hope," Radnor replied. "Look, Monsieur Poirot, I need to be candid with you. I know more than Frida does. She believes her uncle is innocent. I'm not so sure, but let me tell you this. Whatever I know, I'll keep it to myself. I don't want my wife's uncle dragged into a scandal, tried, and hanged for murder." Poirot looked at him with an expression of quiet understanding. "Why tell me all this?" "Because I've heard of you, Monsieur Poirot. You're clever, and you might be able to piece things together. But what good would that do? The poor woman is beyond help now, and she'd turn in her grave at the thought of all this scandal. "You're probably right there," Poirot said softly. "You'd like me to hush it up, then? That's my idea. I'll admit, I'm selfish about it. I've got my future to think of. My business as a tailor and outfitter, things are looking good. Most of us are selfish, Mr. Radnor. Few of us admit it so readily," Poirot said with a smile. "I'll do as you ask, but I warn you, you won't succeed in hushing it up." "Why not?" Radnor frowned. Poirot held up a finger as we stepped onto the bustling market street. "The voice of the people, Mr. Radnor, that's why. Ah, we must hurry or we'll miss our train." "Very interesting, isn't it, Hastings?" Poirot asked as the train began to move. I watched Poirot carefully fix his mustache, the tiny mirror making sure everything was just right. His calm demeanor made me wonder what he truly thought about all of it. But one thing was certain. Poirot wasn't the kind to let sleeping dogs lie. "You seem to find it all amusing, Poirot, while I couldn't help but feel it was sordid and unpleasant. To me, it didn't have the air of a mystery at all." "I agree with you," Poirot said with a small smile. "There is no mystery here whatsoever." I glanced at him, still unconvinced. "I suppose we should just accept Freda's rather extraordinary story about her aunt's infatuation. It was the only thing that seemed remotely odd to me. She was such a nice, respectable woman." Poirot shrugged. "There's nothing extraordinary about it. It's entirely normal. If you read the papers carefully, Hastings, you'll see how often a nice, respectable woman of that age leaves her husband of 20 years, sometimes even her children, to link her life with a younger man. You admire women, don't you? You worship them when they smile at you and look charming. But in reality, you know nothing about them. In the autumn of a woman's life, there comes always one mad moment when she craves romance, excitement, before it's too late. It doesn't escape even a woman who lives in a quiet country town and is the wife of a respectable dentist." I frowned. "And you think that a clever man could take advantage of such a moment?" Poirot said simply. I frowned deeper. "I wouldn't call Pengilly very clever, though. He seems to have the whole town in his grip. Yet, you're right, the only two people who know anything, Radnor and the doctor, both seem intent on hushing it all up. He's managed to do that somehow. I wish we'd seen him." "You can indulge that wish," Poirot replied smoothly. "Return by the next train and invent an aching molar." I shot him a sharp look. "I wish I knew what you found so interesting about this case." Poirot's smile widened. "My interest, Hastings, can be summed up by a remark of yours. After interviewing the maid, you observed that for someone who claimed they weren't going to say a word, she said quite a good deal." "Oh," I said slowly, beginning to grasp his point. "But still, I wonder why you didn't make an attempt to see Pengilly." "Mon ami," Poirot said, his tone calm. "I give him 3 months, then I shall see him, for as long as I please, in the dock." I thought for sure Poirot's prediction would be wrong. The months passed by, and nothing happened in connection to the Cornish case. We became absorbed in other matters, and I almost forgot about Pengilly and his troubles. That is, until I spotted a small paragraph in the newspaper one morning. It stated that an order to exhume Mrs. Pengilly's body had been obtained from the Home Secretary. A few days later, the Cornish mystery was front-page news. The gossip had never truly died down, and when Pengilly's engagement to Miss Marks, his fair-haired secretary, was announced, the tongues started wagging louder than ever. A petition was sent to the Home Secretary, and before long the body was exhumed. Large quantities of arsenic were discovered, and Pengilly was arrested and charged with his wife's murder. Poirot and I attended the preliminary proceedings. The evidence was much as expected. Dr. Adams admitted that symptoms of arsenical poisoning could easily be mistaken for gastritis. The Home Office expert testified, and the maid, Jessie, poured out a flood of information, though much of it was dismissed. Still, it strengthened the case against Pengilly. Frida Stanton testified about how her aunt grew worse whenever she ate food prepared by Pengilly. Then came Jacob Radnor, who explained how he had dropped in unexpectedly the day Mrs. Pengilly died and found Pengilly replacing the bottle of weed killer on the pantry shelf, with her gruel sitting untouched nearby. Finally, Miss Marks, the secretary, was called. She broke down in tears, confessing that there had been passages between her and Pengilly, and that he had promised to marry her if anything happened to his wife. Pengilly reserved his defense and was sent for trial. Jacob Radnor walked back with us to our lodgings in silence. Poirot broke the quiet. "You see, Mr. Radnor," he said, "I was right. The voice of the people spoke, and not in whispers. There was to be no hushing up of this case." Radnor let out a heavy sigh. "You were quite right," he muttered. "Do you see any chance of his getting off?" Poirot stopped, turning to face him. "Well, he has reserved his defense. That means he may have something, as you English say, up his sleeve." He glanced meaningfully at Radnor. "Come in with us, won't you?" Radnor hesitated, but finally accepted the invitation. I ordered 2 whiskeys and sodas, and then, curiosity getting the better of me, I asked for a cup of chocolate. The waiter gave me a bemused look, as though I had ordered something entirely alien, and I wasn't sure if it would ever arrive. Poirot continued, his voice calm and measured. "You know, Hastings, I have a good deal of experience in matters like this, and I see only one loophole for our friend." "What is it?" I asked, leaning forward eagerly. "That you should sign this paper," Poirot said, producing a sheet of paper as swiftly as a conjurer. "What is this?" Radnor asked, his voice laced with a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "A confession that you murdered Mrs. Pengilly," Poirot replied without hesitation. Radnor's laughter was sharp and incredulous. "You must be mad." "Not at all, my friend. Listen," Poirot said, calmly and methodically. "You came here, started a little business, running short of money. Mr. Pengilly was a wealthy man. You met his niece, she smiled upon you, and you were drawn to her. But what you truly wanted was more than her affection. You wanted his money. His wealth, which under normal circumstances would have passed to her on his death, wasn't enough. You had to remove the obstacles, both Pengilly and his wife." I could see the color draining from Radnor's face as Poirot continued. "You made love to the plain, middle-aged Mrs. Pengilly, ensuring she became utterly devoted to you. You implanted doubts in her mind about her husband. She discovered first that he was deceiving her, then, under your guidance, that he was trying to poison her. You had plenty of opportunities to add the arsenic to her food, always careful to do it when Pengilly wasn't around. Being a woman, she talked, perhaps to her niece, perhaps to her friends. Your only real challenge was maintaining 2 separate relationships with the 2 women. But that was easy enough. You convinced the aunt that to allay her husband's suspicions you had to pay court to the niece. The younger lady was only too happy to believe she was no rival to her aunt. Poirot paused, watching Radnor closely. But Mrs. Pengilly made up her mind to consult me. If she could be sure beyond a shadow of a doubt that her husband was poisoning her, she might feel justified in leaving him and joining with you, which, I presume, was what you wanted. But that didn't suit your plan at all. You didn't want me sniffing around. A favorable moment occurred. Pengilly preparing the gruel, and you, in your carelessness, introduced the fatal dose. It was easy after that. You stirred up the gossip, let things appear muddled, and hoped they would be forgotten. But you reckoned without Hercule Poirot, my intelligent friend." Radnor's face was deadly pale now, but he still tried to maintain his composure. "Very interesting and ingenious," he said, though his voice wavered. "But why tell me all this?" "Because, monsieur," Poirot replied softly, "I don't represent the law. I represent Mrs. Pengilly. For her sake, I give you a chance to escape. Sign this paper, and you shall have 24 hours. 24 hours before I hand it over to the police." Radnor hesitated, his defiance crumbling. "You can't prove anything," he muttered weakly. "Can't I?" Poirot said, a steely glint in his eyes. "I am Hercule Poirot. Look out the window, monsieur." He gestured toward the glass. "There are 2 men in the street. They've been instructed not to lose sight of you." Radnor strode across to the window, yanked back the blind, and recoiled with a curse. "You see, monsieur, sign. It's your best chance." Radnor stood there, his pride broken, his defiance replaced by fear. After a long pause, he reluctantly nodded. "What guarantee do I have?" "That I will keep my word?" Poirot interrupted smoothly. "The word of Hercule Poirot is sufficient. You will sign?" With trembling hands, Radnor signed the paper, his signature a trembling scrawl. Poirot folded the paper, and then, with a small gesture, he instructed me to pull down the blind halfway. That, Poirot explained, was the signal that Radnor might leave unmolested. White-faced, muttering curses, Radnor rushed from the room. Poirot watched him go with a faint smile. "A coward," Poirot said softly. "I always knew it." I glared at Poirot, my anger rising. "It seems to me, Poirot, that you've acted in a criminal manner," I exclaimed. "You always preach against sentiment, and here you are, letting a dangerous criminal escape out of sheer sentimentality." Poirot turned, his expression calm. "That was not sentiment, Hastings. That was business. Do you not see? We have no proof against him. If I were to stand before 12 stolid Cornishmen and say, 'I, Hercule Poirot, no,' they would laugh in my face. The only chance was to scare him into a confession." I didn't reply. I knew Poirot was right. Poirot continued, "Those 2 loafers outside, they were very useful. Pull down the blind again, Hastings. Not that there was ever any need to raise it. It was all part of our little play." "Well, well," Poirot said, straightening. "We must keep our word." 24 hours, did I say? So much longer for poor Mr. Pengilly, and it is no more than he deserves. After all, he deceived his wife. I am very strong on the family life, as you know. Ah, well, 24 hours, and then. I have great faith in Scotland Yard. They will get him, mon ami, they will get him. At the end of this dramatic tale, a dynamic lesson emerges. In life, as in mystery, sometimes the pursuit of justice requires more than facts. It demands courage, ingenuity, and the wisdom to recognize when the truth cannot be proven but only feared.